I was living in a suburban town near Hattiesburg, Mississippi. If you've never been there, I would say the easiest way to describe it is quiet. Nothing happens around there. It's a place for retired folks to move to and settle down in, and that's exactly what my great aunt had decided to do. She was one of the last remaining members of my family that I spoke to. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I'll say that my family's dynamic is complex. And needless to say, my great aunt Carol was getting older, so I decided to move in with her and help out. At the time, I had nothing going for me. I was 26, bussing tables at a local Mexican restaurant that did way more business than it deserved to, making my shit-for-pay job a hell of a lot more cumbersome than it needed to be. So when an opportunity came up for me to live rent-free, I took it. And on top of everything, it was for a good cause. So as soon as I could, I packed what few things I had in the room that I was staying in, and I drove from Lafayette to my great aunt Carol's. As easy as that. Her house was large. Not massive, but larger than you would expect for a single woman to own. To be fair, she hadn't always lived alone. My great uncle, her husband Larkin, used to live with her. I had never really got to know him so well. I'd met him a handful of times, maybe seen him once in the past 5 years. I really only caught my great aunt when she would visit her friends in Lafayette, and he would rarely come with her. And as she got older, she stopped driving, and I could really only keep up with her over the phone, meaning what little relationship I had with Uncle Larkin was reduced down to a single picture I had of the three of us and the occasional, "Well, tell Uncle Larkin hi for me," to which she would kindly oblige. I think it was around January of last year that Larkin ended up passing away, a heart attack, if I remember correctly. It was all very sudden, and I remember speaking with Aunt Carol about it, her being very saddened by the whole thing, understandably so. I can only imagine the emotional toll of losing someone so close to you in your old age. All the time you'd spent with them, the looming mortality that suddenly seems ever closer to taking you. She didn't seem much in a good place. That's when I had tossed around the idea of coming to stay with her, and she'd always been fairly reluctant. Carol was a proud woman, only a bit more than she had the right to be. But she was a very strong-willed woman, so I didn't press too much. Not up until a month ago when she had a minor stroke. When I'd visited her at the hospital, I had told her that I was going to go home and gather my things, and that I was going to come and stay with her, which I did. I moved my things into a small room upstairs in her house, a room that had earlier in my life seemed much larger. Aunt Carol lived downstairs in the master bedroom. The living room, right outside of her door, was large, adorned with a great chandelier that hung over a thick maroon rug that covered most of the living room floor. On the far wall was a massive window with a panoramic view of her backyard. A garden, a shed, and a large stretch of grass that backed up to a forest. I remembered playing in that forest as a kid, the journeys I would pretend to go on, just me and a trusted stick. Back then, the woods seemed so majestic. Now, standing in the middle of the dark living room looking out, they seemed much more dark and ominous. My daily routine became about the same throughout the first few weeks. I would wake up and prepare breakfast for myself and Carol. She would come sulking from her bedroom around 8 a.m. each morning and sit at the dining room table, which sat directly in front of the large window. I would bring her food and sit with my food, and we would discuss what we wanted for dinner and what sort of things I should grab while I'm out. My errands usually just entailed groceries, with the occasional plant store shop or a trip to the home goods store for a light bulb or cleaning supplies. Carol was surprisingly low effort. As I said, she was a proud woman, and part of that was maintaining the facade that she could take care of herself. I would often come home to find her working in her herb garden or reading. More often than not, I would come home to find her nested away in her room, the door closed, leaving the house to me, which was often quite nice. At times, she really just felt like a roommate. Carol was quite soft-spoken, rarely probed about my life. She'd always just kind of accepted me for who I was, no questions asked, which is exactly why I'd always found refuge in her. Her and I both found solace in the fact that we felt estranged from the rest of the family, and I appreciated her for that. As the first few weeks went by, I did start to notice things about Aunt Carol that had never really previously stuck out to me, mostly because we'd never spent such an extended amount of time together. She, as I said earlier, spent a lot of time alone in her room, which isn't all that strange. But sometimes I would come home to find the house empty and dark, save for the light on in her room, and I would hear talking aloud. For a while, I dismissed it as her on the phone. I didn't think twice about it, but there was something about the pacing of the conversation that didn't seem right. She would often pause mid-sentence and begin muttering indistinguishable words under her breath. There would be long lapses of silence, and at one time, I'd found her cell phone on the dining room table as her conversation rolled on from inside of her room. Most of this I equated to her being old. She had, after all, been through a stroke. She was rapidly approaching the age of 78, and that would understandably have some sort of effect on the psyche, so I tried to ignore it. Sometimes I would hear her late at night, echoing up the stairwell. To be honest, it did spook me quite a bit. I had asked her about it one morning as we sat and ate breakfast. She had told me that she was just talking on the phone. I didn't say anything in return. Instead, I said okay and resumed eating breakfast. But in that moment, I had realized for the first time that I was living with someone I didn't really know that much about. Someone that wasn't afraid to lie to me. Or even more, someone that might actually be having a deteriorating mental state. Adults lying to me was nothing new. It was always a bit funny how many think they're being cunning and getting away with a blatant lie when really I just lack the energy to call them out on it. But with Carol, it really just made me a bit sad. I finished eating and I took our plates to the kitchen for cleaning, talking about the day's tasks as I did so. She'd said she wanted chicken soup for dinner, a dish I was more than capable of making. She needed soil for the garden, some various groceries, and she gave me the address of a bookshop that she had ordered a book from. As I finished up washing the dishes, she remained in her seat, staring out of the big windows, still and stoic. I couldn't help but think that her mind seemed to be withering away as the days went by. After a few more moments, I heard the faintest muttering of words, and then she stood up and slowly disappeared back into her room. My trip to the store was the same as always, meandering through the same aisles that I could never seem to remember. I managed to grab some soil from the small gardening section that the grocery store had, which saved me a trip to the plant store. So that only left my trip to the bookstore. And since the grocery store was close, I ran home and I started the soup since it needed a few hours to cook. After I situated the pot on the stove, I hopped in my car and plugged in the address that Carol had given me, and I drove to it. When I had arrived, I was parked out front of a small house in a suburb about 20 minutes from Carol's. I double-checked the address, and it still checked out. I thought for a moment about the thoughts that I was having earlier about Carol sort of losing her mind. But then again, we were in Mississippi, and I guess that there isn't anything abnormal about someone running a bookshop from their home. So I went up to the door and I knocked. A voice from inside asked who was there, and I said that I was there to pick up a book for Carol's sitter. The person opened up the door slightly to reveal a wrinkled, tired face of an old man. Maybe not too old. It was the kind of face that looks more worn by cigarettes and liquor than by time. He looked me up and down and said to wait a moment, closing the door again. I stood there and looked around his patio. It was decaying. The wood looked dead and there was mold growing on the door frame. It seemed like this person didn't go outside much. The door opened again, only slightly, and the man handed me a book wrapped in newspaper. And then he told me to have a nice day, and he closed the door in my face. And that was that. I stood for another moment wondering if I needed to pay, but I guess I didn't, so I took the book and I got back in my car. The book was heavy. I drove about a block away and I stopped the car. I was curious to know a little bit more about my aunt, especially after the whole revelation, or whatever you'd care to call me, finally coming to realize that Carol's really just some lady who I had a blood relation to and who I knew only on a fairly superficial level. I wanted to know what she sat around reading all day, what she cared about, what kinds of things she did that she didn't tell me. I guess I developed a sudden fascination with the Carol that lived inside the master bedroom. I unfolded the newspaper and revealed what was a thick, plain book. The exterior was some sort of felt material, like fabric. It was dark, faded green, with no text on it whatsoever, just blank, front and back. I flipped it open and immediately noticed that many of the pages had been written all over, words circled, underlined, small drawings in the margins, lines going every which way. I looked closer to see the text below the scrawlings, and it looked to be something like an instruction manual. It almost looked like a cookbook in a way, but with very detailed steps. The illustration printed on the page I was looking at had a large circle with concentric lines all around its diameter, all leading to the center of the circle. On the side was a list of ingredients like thyme, oak bark, mostly plants. As I flipped through more of the pages, I found most of the book to be about the same. It was separated into different sections, each with its own list of materials, instructions, and an illustration to pair. They were rituals. That explains the strange man. It would take a strange person to sell a book like this, and I'm sure that these drawings were probably done by him. But I wasn't exactly sure what my Aunt Carol would want with a book like this. Then again, I was beginning to think she was losing her mind, so it seemed to fit right into the picture. I wrapped it back up and drove the rest of the way home thinking about whether or not I should ask her about it. My mind was reeling for no fair reason, just anxiety, I suppose. So I decided to take a detour and head to the bar for a drink or two. I got home just a bit before dusk, and the house was dark. Dark save for the usual sliver of light escaping from under Carol's door, out into the living room, onto the carpet. That and the moonlight from the large window on the far wall. I turned on the kitchen light and checked on the soup, which looked to be more than ready. I went towards Carol's door, and as I approached, I could hear the slightest mumbling coming from within. I slowed my step. As I said, my curiosity was beginning to peak. I wanted to get a better idea of what she was saying. So I crept towards the door. At first, I couldn't make out much, but as I got closer, this is what I heard. Yes. Still fresh, hun. Don't worry. Yes. It should be here tonight. She was silent for about the next 3 minutes. That's when I began to feel ridiculous listening in on her. It felt wrong. I didn't like feeling like a sleuth, especially not towards my aunt. So I decided to knock and tell her that dinner was ready. I served us both at the table, and with her bowl of soup, I brought her book, which I had rewrapped in the newspaper. She thanked me for getting it and set it on her lap. We ate, and I asked her what she'd done that day. She said garden work, and that she'd worked on turning the soil after I dropped off the new bag of mulch earlier in the day. I asked if she needed any help with the gardening, to which she said no, in her familiar bravado. I asked if she had a lawnmower in the shed, and offered to mow the lawn since it was becoming fairly overgrown. And she didn't respond. There was a bit of a change in the air at that point. I remember noticing that. She looked up from her soup, past me, across the table and out the window that was behind me. And she said, "There's no need." That's all she said on the matter. I decided to change the subject. The next morning, I decided to go for a run. I was becoming increasingly lazy now that my daily tasks were so simplistic, so I got up early and ran around the neighborhood. It was a very spaced-out subdivision, most of it backed up to the same forest, so the plot of land that each house had was fairly generous. But nobody was outside. It was early, but even so, I couldn't help but notice the whole neighborhood seemed eerily silent. I was beginning to think that I might have been developing a bit of a paranoia. Living in Carol's house was beginning to take a bit of a toll on me. The repetitive nature of my days, her strange mumbling, and the overall uneventful nature of things was pretty far from where I imagined myself in my mid-20s. But the world was a difficult place to afford, and I wasn't fit for making money. I jogged around the block, soon ending up back at my aunt's. I took a minute to cool off in the backyard. The air was crisp. It was early November, and things were beginning to cool off really nicely. So I shed my long-sleeved shirt, and I sat on a bench near the backyard patio, looking out towards the yard and the forest beyond it. Then I looked to the shed, and I noticed a padlock that had been put on the door. I couldn't recall if it had been there before, but after I thought a bit more, I remembered having left some gardening materials in the shed about a week earlier. And after closer inspection, I came to find that the lock did look significantly newer than the rest of the shed. I made my way inside upstairs to change out of my sweaty clothes and rinse myself off. By the time I got out of the shower, it was nearly 8 a.m., meaning Carol would soon be awake for breakfast. It was overcast out, so I figured something cozy was in order. I decided on some oats. The sound of Carol's muffled voice could be heard droning on from inside of her room. From midway down the stairs, I could see the familiar faint shred of light coming from below her bedroom door, and out with it, mumbling that I couldn't understand from my distance. Once again, my curiosity took over, and I found myself inching my way down the stairs and towards her door. The words were still difficult to make out, even as I got closer. It seemed like her voice was just beyond the point of understanding, just indistinguishable enough. So I continued to creep closer, inching towards the light under her door, her words becoming ever louder as I began to pick out maybe every other word. That was when my foot reached the edge of the rug and depressed a loose floorboard, sending the faintest creak out into the room. My eyes had clicked down to my foot. I froze, as if one single sound would have sent her flying into a rage, but no, none of that. Instead, what happened was that everything froze, not only me. Carol's voice from inside the room had completely halted. And just as I'd looked up from my foot and back towards the light coming from underneath her door, that too vanished in an instant. I stood in the darkness, scared to move, partially from fear and partially from embarrassment that I'd been creeping through the house. I tried my best to shift my weight back towards the rug, making as little sound as possible. And once back on the padded flooring, I silently made my way to the kitchen, trying my best to look as if that's where I'd been all morning. My mind, however, was still fixated on the fact that whatever it was that Carol was saying, she wanted to say in secret, complete secret, something that wasn't even to be heard in passing. As she surfaced from her room and made her way to the dining room, there was an apparent air in the room between us both, as if we'd each been caught doing something we didn't want the other knowing of. In turn, we were both trying our best to pretend that it hadn't happened. We sat and ate the oats I'd prepared, mostly in silence, until Carol spoke up about the errands for the day. She told me she ordered an antique desk from a man a ways north, nearly a 2-hour drive. I wanted to ask her why she would order something so far away, but I bit my tongue. It was obvious why she would do that, because she didn't have to go fetch it for herself. I asked her for all the necessary information, as well as a phone number for the man she had contacted for the desk. She gave me a crumpled piece of paper with all the details scrawled across it in very lightly drawn pencil, writing done by a hand that couldn't muster much more strength. Just looking at her delicate handwriting made me a bit sad. She thanked me and resumed eating her food. And as I watched her shaking hand deliver each small bite of oatmeal, my guilt began to surge. I felt ridiculous, foolish even, for being so prying about her life, so judgmental. I mean, she was old. She'd been through so much. She'd opened up her home to me, the one who'd initiated coming in the first place. I had no right to barge into someone's life and begin dusting for dirty fingerprints, or even feel burdened for having to drive and pick up a desk for them. Maybe I was the one beginning to lose my mind. I left the house around 11 and began driving. I'd spent most of my time between breakfast and leaving making sure I had the necessary ropes available for the inevitable task of harnessing a desk into the trunk of my Toyota Camry. I was feeling pathetic at that point. That I'd come into her home in the first place, how low my life had seemed to drop to the point of spying on my stroke victim of a great aunt. I felt like I should just keep driving and not return to her house. All I did was get her groceries. I cooked her meals. It was apparent that I wasn't an entirely necessary addition to her life. I was just saving her some money so she didn't instead pay a service to do these things for her. At the end of the day, I was pretty sure that I was the charity case. And these thoughts just kept on until I reached the house of the man selling the desk. Once again, I found myself in a suburb. But for an antique desk, I suppose that it made more sense. So I walked up the sidewalk to the door of the home, this one actually quite a bit nicer than the last, and I knocked on the door. There was no answer for a long moment, so I knocked again, this time a bit louder, and still no reply. I stood for a long minute, triple-checked the address on the paper she had given me, and the address matched. This was where I was supposed to be. I crumpled it up and shoved it in my pocket, and I stood for a bit longer. As I was walking back to my car, I heard what sounded like someone coming out of a side door. I walked towards the driveway and saw an older woman exiting the home, walking towards the garage. She seemed a bit surprised to see me, which made me realize I didn't look entirely presentable that day. I suppose my internal state had begun to show on the outside a bit as well. I straightened myself up and I told her that I was there to pick up the table She seemed confused, so I clarified that I was there for an antique sale, that I had the information to meet with a Rick who had posted the table that my aunt had agreed to purchase online. She told me, "There isn't any Rick here, hon. You've got the wrong address." And my stomach clenched. I apologized for having spooked her, and I went back to my car. And I sat in the driver's seat, clenching my fists. 2 hours of driving, and I was at the wrong address. I started the engine and took a deep, methodical breath to try and stabilize my heart rate. I don't know why I was having such a strong reaction. I tried to relax, turning up the AC. It had just started to rain outside, and all the raindrops on my windshield were doing their job to coax me into a calm. Where the hell was I? That seemed to be the question that I'd been asking myself for weeks, but now it had taken a bit more of a literal sense. I took the crumpled paper from my pocket, straightened it out, in order to find the number of Rick that Carol had given me. I dialed it into my phone, took a deep breath, and I called it, prepared to find him telling me that he was instead on South Elmont Drive, not North Elmont Drive. The phone rang for a few cycles, and soon a voice answered the phone with a short, "Yep." I stumbled across introducing myself and managed to get out that I was sent to pick up a desk for Carol, that I had apparently gone to the wrong address, to which he had asked who I was calling for. I said Rick, knowing full well by that point that the number that I had dialed was not in fact Rick, and that the information Carol had given me was entirely incorrect. My suspicions were quickly confirmed, and the voice on the other end curtly stated that they were Kenny and that I had the wrong number, promptly hanging up before I could even manage a response. I immediately dialed Carol's phone number, hoping that she could instead just send me the web page of where she bought the table and that I could handle the rest from there, but she didn't answer. My grip on the phone tightened. I was beginning to lose my cool. Not really due to her or this particular incident. It was just turning into one of those days where everything seemed to be conjuring a stronger static sound in my head. She was old and a bit senile. That much was clear by this point. I blamed myself for not confirming the information before I left. I decided to just head home. It's not as if she needed this desk today, and I figured I might be able to benefit from a nap or a drink. I arrived at Carol's almost 2.5 hours later, the rain having rolled in at full force right as rush hour hit, slowing the already slow-paced traffic to a near halt. I gathered myself before I entered the house. I didn't want to seem angry at Carol, even though I really was annoyed at having wasted my entire day on a worthless trip across town. I made my way into the backyard quickly so as to avoid the rainfall, and on the way I found something strange. The garden, Carol's herb garden, had been dug up. There were still plants, but they were strewn all around the plant bed. The soil was upturned, and it looked as if it had been flung all around the yard by something. I thought that maybe a dog had made its way onto the property, but as I stood there in the rain staring at it, my brain almost involuntarily flashed images of Carol on her hands and knees, flinging the plants in the soil all around the yard like a lunatic. It was apparent by this point that my hostile attributions towards Carol were starting to take control of my mind. As much as I tried to ignore her odd goings-on as old age quirks, I couldn't help but find myself spooked by her mental state as I spent more time in her home. I went inside to shower off and change into something comfortable. Carol's light was off. Perhaps she didn't answer her phone because she'd been sleeping all day. I looked around the house for signs of dirt to see if maybe it had been her that upturned the garden after all, but the house looked as clean as it had before I left. I showered, shaved, and spent a good amount of time looking at myself in the mirror, wondering when exactly I would leave this house. I was starting to wonder if I did matter to Carol, if me leaving would be a relief to her, or if it would feel like abandonment. I decided I would talk to her about it at dinner, and I went downstairs to begin cooking something for us to eat. I prepped some chicken, put it in the oven to bake, pouring myself a generous glass of whiskey for the wait. I sat at the dining room table to watch the rain, but my eyes remained fixated on the upturned garden. I was trying to figure out what had happened to it. It wasn't a simple hole. No, the entire plot, almost 6 feet long, had been dug up. Some of the plants were still in the soil, others laying nearby in piles of dirt. It didn't look like a single dog could have or would have done this, nor did it look like someone had stolen any plants. It just looked like someone had gone digging in the garden. My thoughts continued to flow on the matter until I realized that my glass was empty. I suppose I'd been thinking harder than I realized, and as I stood up to refill it, I was relieved to find the liquor had done its job. For the first time all day, I felt a bit at ease. I walked into the kitchen to check on the chicken, and after finding it was nearly done, I refilled my glass and walked to Carol's room to let her know that dinner was nearly ready. I listened first for any sort of sound coming from within, but it was silent. I didn't want to wake her if she had been napping, but it was dinner time, and I didn't feel much like serving her dinner any time later. I wanted to take the rest of the night off from Carol. I knocked on her door and said that I'd made baked chicken for us. She didn't respond, so I knocked again, louder, perhaps a bit too loud, but I'd been drinking, so my inhibitions were low. Still, she didn't respond. I thought momentarily about opening up the door, but I didn't feel right about peeping into her room, especially not after the incident earlier that day. So I decided I would eat dinner alone. I fixed myself a plate and sat down at the table to eat. The rain continued to fall outside as the sun set, the patter of rain on the window, lulling my boozed mind into an almost entranced state of calm. I gazed blankly out the large window, out at the yard, out towards the forest edge, and then over towards the shed, where I noticed a hint of light escaping from under its door. I tried to focus my vision on it, though after a few drinks my eyesight was having trouble adjusting. But it was there. The faintest glow, almost flickering, as it was coming from inside the shed. I hadn't seen a light in there previously, and after thinking on it a bit, I was sure that the shed had no electricity whatsoever. I looked towards its door, remembering the padlock that I'd seen on it the day before, and it was gone. Now, the idea that someone had been attempting to steal from the garden didn't seem too out of the picture, and I worried that someone might be stealing from the shed. I stood up and walked to Carol's door, knocking a bit louder than I intended this time, asking her to wake up. She still didn't respond, and I waited a moment, but almost involuntarily I decided to open up the door and walk into what I quickly realized was an empty room. The lights were off, the bed was made, the entire room had been almost immaculately cleaned. I'd slipped on a windbreaker that I kept hanging on a rack next to the front door, and I made my way outside and around the corner of the house towards the backyard. As I approached the backyard, I could see even clearer the light emanating from inside the shed. I walked towards it slowly, and as I got closer, I realized the possibility that perhaps it was Carol in the shed all along. So I called out to her from the middle of the yard and waited for a reply. Nothing. Not until I heard the rear doors of the shed open, the light from within shooting out towards the forest. I called Carol's name again. I listened for anything, any sound to emanate out from the static of the rainfall from the doorway. There was no noise. Instead, around the corner of the shed came a face peering out at me. It looked like a man, but he was tall, nearly 6 feet tall as I was, and he was black. A dark black. I couldn't barely make out any of his features except for the 2 white eyes staring at me from the middle of his obscured face. Before I could even attempt to gain focus, he turned away from me and he ran towards the forest. And in a moment of foolish panic, I followed suit. I pulled my phone from my pocket and I turned the flash on, using it to stay fixated on the man. He was slow, much slower than I was, but I kept my distance, trying to keep him in my light. I could see him moving almost as if he were exhausted. His limbs were lanky and flailing, running into the trees as he barreled ahead. I called out to him to stop, but he kept running, aimlessly. My mind was flying, wondering who this man was, and with the endless possibilities of Carol, if whoever this was had taken her. I called again, this time louder, asking him who he was, for him to stop running. He kept his pace. Then again I shouted at him to stop, and I asked him, almost foolishly, what he'd done with Carol, what he'd done with my aunt. And that's when he'd slowed down to a stop. I aimed my light at him. Through the falling rain, the details of his body came into view. He was nude, and his black skin, it wasn't black, but it was covered in dirt. His skin underneath it was white, a pale, almost sickly white. It looked curdled and bumpy under the mud that covered it. I could see what looked to be open wounds on his thigh and around his stomach. I aimed my light higher up at his face, and that's when I realized who the man that I was staring at was. Standing in the rain before me, naked and covered in mud, was my great-uncle Larkin. His face was strobing in the light of my phone, my hand shaking. I could hear his strained breathing through the sounds of rainfall, see what looked like dirt and blood coming from an open hole in his cheek. For a moment I thought that I was losing my mind, but it was real. This was Larkin, some semblance of him at least. I stood still. I couldn't move. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, though likely it was nothing more than a moment. But my terror was so palpable, more than I could ever describe to you in a way that you would be able to understand. This was no ghost, no fleeting apparition. It wasn't a shadow. Larkin stood before me, flesh and blood, naked, looking at me with those 2 stark wide eyes. Eyes stricken with a look of terror far beyond that of my own. I remember that the most. I see his bewildered face, an infinite flash of it, and then I see him turn and run deeper into the woods. And I see myself standing in place, unwavering, until the sounds of his footsteps are lost in the rain. I checked the entire house up and down. I called to local authorities and reported my aunt missing. They informed me that the amount of missing elderly calls that they receive is actually quite high, as if to conjure some sort of relief in that fact. They questioned me about what I'd experienced that night, and I told them about the garden. I told them about the shed, and I told them about the man in the shed, and that I'd chased him into the woods. I didn't tell them who I thought the man to be. Even just hours after it had happened, I already began to doubt it, in what was assuredly more of an attempt to calm myself. Because I knew. I was sure of who I'd seen in the forest that night. The local officer asked me to come to the station, apologizing for the fact that they would have to ask me more questions there regarding my aunt. He chaperoned me to the car, and as I sat in the back of the cruiser, I realized that that was the safest I'd felt in weeks. I stared out through the bars on the window, out towards the forest edge, knowing that after the police cruiser had left this neighborhood, I would never return. And I was right.